Yesterday, in the capital of Syria, in Damascus, a missile took out and destroyed one of the consulate buildings in the Iranian embassy. Everybody widely attributes that to Israel. I don't think anybody thinks it's anybody else that would do it, which really broke a big taboo in the intentional targeting and destruction of a embassy building. I don't know that, other than our alleged accidental strike into the Chinese embassy in 1999 in Yugoslavia, I don't think that anyone has ever hit an embassy, certainly not to this degree. So it's already groundbreaking and eye-opening and alarming about what may come next. Iran has been saying, and especially today, vowed that there was definite retaliation that's going to come. And according to some reports that I just saw before we came on air here, possibly within 48 hours. To try and untangle this mess, we bring on back to the show Dan DePetris, a fellow at Defense Priorities, where I work also, and our absolute resident expert on all things Iran. We always turn to him on any of these things, and so I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on to talk about this really possibly explosive issue than Dan. So Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks for having me.
Well, just before, actually, no, I guess it was a little earlier, John Kirby has spoken about this issue, about what the retaliation is going to be. And like so many other things, he likes to say, hey, this wasn't our deal. We didn't do this. But here's what he's saying from the U.S. perspective.
I can't predict what the Supreme Leader and what the IRGC will decide to do or not. I don't know in terms of retaliation. I assume you mean against the United States. Let me make it clear. We had nothing to do with what the strike in Damascus. We weren't involved in any way whatsoever. So the comments by the Iranian foreign minister that somehow we're to be held to account or that we're to blame is just nonsense. We had nothing to do with it.
Now, you know, it's ironic, Dan. I think that even if we actually didn't have anything to do with it, and I would imagine we probably didn't. I can't imagine we'd be okay with something like this. But even if we did, we have done so many other things that have turned out to be so, and especially as we're helping overtly Israel to such an extent in its Gaza Strip operation here, it's hard to disentangle ourselves from that. And it almost doesn't matter whether it's true or not. If the Iranians want to believe it, they're going to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Iranians operate on an assumption that, you know, the Israelis talk to the United States on these very, very secretive missions, operations, and that, you know, we sort of green light what the Israelis do. I don't think that's the case. I think the Israelis are actually quite independent in their operational planning, and they do what they need to do and what they feel is required to safeguard their national interests and their national security. So, you know, the Iranians have an assumption, but I'm not necessarily sure that that assumption is correct. But like you said, it really doesn't matter if it's correct. The Iranians seem to believe it regardless.
And to what extent have you been able to identify or divine from reading the tea leaves or reading between the lines, how much is the U.S. and Israel tied together intelligence-wise in terms of sharing information back and forth? Because I know there's always a lot of more sensitivity there than some people may realize.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt the United States has an extremely close intelligence relationship with, you know, the Mossad, the Shin Bet. We've had instances where we've actually handed over not targeting intelligence necessarily, but strategic intelligence, you know, the ISR that you would expect to the Israelis in pertaining to the war in Gaza. So we'll help the Israelis kind of survey the scene. And mainly that is for getting the hostages out, trying to locate the hostages that still remain in Gaza. The United States, as far as I know, does not hand over, you know, specific locations of Hamas commanders to the Israelis. I think the Israelis can pretty much figure all that stuff out by themselves because they have a pretty extensive connection to what's going on in the Palestinian enclave. But there's no question that there's a huge, very close relationship going back decades in the intelligence realm.
And to what extent have you seen that maybe fray a little bit around the edges since October 7th and all the things that have gone on with that? We've had on our show a number of times of these really divergent views between what the U.S. administration is saying and what we want to see happen, and then what Netanyahu and some of his other administration or cabinet members say afterwards, which seem to be more and more divergent with Israel going more on its own way. Have you seen that change?
I haven't seen a change. No, the only change I've seen is rhetorical. So the administration um, basically makes these very prescient points in the press to kind of put distance between itself and what Israel is doing in Gaza. But in terms of policy, I think the policy is pretty consistent and has been consistent over the last 6 months, which is essentially we're not going to condition our military aid to the Israelis. It's going to be sort of an unconditional stream of weapons and munitions. We can argue whether that's wise or not. I would argue it's obviously not wise, but that is the policy. So the rhetoric does not match the policy at all.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. All right, well, let's turn our attention to what actually happened here, and see if you can give us some idea of, at least from your assessment, from your foxhole there, what was the motivation behind it? For the moment, let's just assume that it was Israel, and we know, because we've talked about it many times, that they've long conducted assassination operations. They've taken out many people, even since October the 7th in Syria. They hit the Damascus airport, and I think one other on more than one occasion. So this stuff's been going on. There was a big strike against the Syrian army in Aleppo on the 28th of March, which didn't get a whole lot of press here, but this one obviously seems to. What do you think would have been the motivation for Israel to want to take such a high-profile issue as to strike an embassy, when that really had kind of been a taboo that the whole world focused up or faced up until that point?
Yeah, well, I think this was probably a case, reading the tea leaves here, because I don't have access to classified intelligence or anything like that. But I suspect that the Israelis really wanted to take out this individual, and his name is Mohammed Reza Zahedi, and he's a very, very high-ranking IRGC Iranian general who was responsible for pretty much oversight of IRGC activities in Syria and Lebanon. And he served as a very, very basically instrumental individual between Iran and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and Iran and all the Shia militias in eastern Syria. So he was very instrumental, very powerful, very influential. And he was with the IRGC from the very beginning. So he was a veteran. He joined in 1981, a year after the IRGC was founded. So he's a veteran, and the Israelis found out he was in this building and took him out.
So taking him out is I mean, I can, for that reason, his lineage, I can certainly see militarily why Israel would want to do that. But why the embassy? Because anytime you take an operation, you always have to calculate potential enemy responses and retaliations. And it would seem that would be, if we saw what happened when Soleimani was taken out in 2020, this would seem to be at least as high, maybe even higher, owing to the fact of the embassy being hit as well. So what do you think that might have been their thinking in that? I mean, because if they hit him on the way in or on the way out of the building, that would be one thing. But waiting until he was inside the building seems like the expectation is there's going to be a higher risk of Iranian retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned in the beginning, the Israelis have pretty much conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the last decade, and they've taken out a lot of IRGC commanders and advisors over the last 5 years or so. This is the first one where they've actually targeted a diplomatic facility in the heart of the Syrian capital. So it's certainly significant, and it sort of, if you were a member of the international law community, you would say this is probably against diplomatic protocol, and a lot of people have made that argument. The Israelis, however, don't view this specific building as a diplomatic facility. They basically take the position of, well, this is basically a facility that the Iranians have used to plan operations. So it's more of a military facility as opposed to a diplomatic facility. Obviously, that's the Israelis' viewpoint. Many others in the international community take the complete opposite perspective. So this might be just the case of the Israelis having a golden opportunity to take out somebody who they probably wanted to assassinate for a very, very long time.
And what do you think the argument that some are making that that Israel is actually trying to draw Iran into a war because they want to, quote, finish this once and for all. They've been tired of messing with them. And so now they're taking increasingly provocative actions, wanting to draw them in, maybe also to draw the U.S. in so that we can then help them get rid of their enemy. I mean, obviously that's all speculation, but certainly a lot of people making that argument. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think the Israelis want a wider war because they have their hands full right now. I mean, they've been in Gaza for the last 6 months, and from all indications, their objectives have not been met yet. And, you know, they still have about 100 hostages held in Gaza, and Hamas still has operational capability inside Gaza and even in the West Bank. So they have their hands full. Plus, they're dealing with the situation in the north where you know, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and Hezbollah have been firing, you know, a variety of rockets and anti-tank missiles and you know, precision guided munitions over the Lebanese-Israeli border, and that's been happening since October 8th, the one day after the Hamas attacks in Gaza. So the Israelis have their hands full. I don't think they want a wider conflict with Iran. I don't think Iran wants a wider conflict with Israel because they assume that the United States would probably be involved militarily in some way. So this is probably an extension of the Israel-Iran, what we call the shadow war between the Israelis and the Iranians that has been playing out in the region for the better part of a decade, if not more.
Now that's obviously we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We do know, as you mentioned, this is an ongoing shadow war, which sometimes comes in and out of the shadows. But at least in some of the people in Tehran right now are really upset about this. And we had this one fellow here was on the Middle Eastern news earlier today. So the question is really going to be, sorry, we didn't have the sound on that, so we had the translation on the bottom. The issue is going to be, okay, people can always come out and say whatever they want on the streets, and the leaders very often in countries will put people out on the streets to say things they want. But then that's the question. If the people are, quote, demanding, you know, a retaliation that this hasn't worked in the past and they've been doing these things to us, and now then it's an active war, so we have to respond, then that kind of puts them in a position, the government, where they have to make good on something, or they maybe even undercut their own position within their own country. As a matter of fact, this is what some of the leaders of Tehran have been saying.
Iran, however, has vowed vengeance, saying that the retaliation will be of the same magnitude. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister said Benjamin Netanyahu has completely lost his mental balance.
So you've been following Iran for quite a long time, and you know what happened after we took out Soleimani and some of the vows that they made, and then subsequently there was this 100 missile barrage into Al-Assad Air Base, where the U.S. were many hundreds were, or 100 rather, were had traumatic brain injuries afterwards. None were killed, and there's some speculation that there was some coordination between the two so that they could have their retaliation, but not harm or not kill any Americans. And I don't know if that's true or not. None that were killed, but we do know that there was a pretty large barrage, and it really blew up a lot of buildings of ours on that base. So what do you think now? What do you expect in retaliation from Tehran, given this affront on their diplomacy or on their diplomatic embassy, and the demands apparently on the street from people to respond, especially given his claim there that it has to be of something equal value?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that the Iranians will respond. You know, they have a track record of retaliating to slights that are real or perceived. And this goes far back. This goes beyond the January 2020 incident that you referenced. You know, when Israel has taken out some ships in the Iranian ships in the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians responded that with actual drone strikes or drone kamikaze strikes against Israeli-owned vessels, civilian vessels. So the Iranians will respond. The question, of course, is how are they going to respond? I think the least likely scenario is something, like a ballistic missile attack on an Israeli target inside Israel. I don't think that's even remotely possible, because the Iranians do not want a full-scale war with Israel, and they probably understand that they would lose a war with Israel. One of the options would probably be striking Israeli diplomatic facilities, whether it's in embassies or consulates overseas. And we've had incidents in the past where Israeli diplomats and diplomatic staff have been attacked overseas, even in Southeast, as far away as Southeast Asia. There's also a non-kinetic response. The Iranians don't have to necessarily respond kinetically. And by that, I mean they could actually increase their uranium enrichment in their Iranian nuclear facilities. We've also had cases in the past where the Iranians have chosen to take that route, both to register their protest and to basically take a retaliatory action that gets people's attention, but also kind of decreases the likelihood of a shooting war. So that's also a possibility that Iran might take.
Yeah.
There's a lot of options the Iranians could take, obviously, and the Israelis will have to be ready for all of them. So we'll have to wait and see what it is. I wouldn't necessarily assume that it's going to come within a week or 2 weeks. It could come months down the line too. We just don't know.
Now, on that point, so, and it's going to be impossible for us to really ascertain exactly what inventories are, because that's always a state secret by every country about what their military arsenals are. But it seems like a case could be made and a calculation could be at least pondered in Tehran that can they really not afford a war with Israel right now? Because Israel is obviously expending enormous amounts of ammunition in its Gaza operation, now into its 6th month of operation. And we've been continuing to give them a lot more weapons and ammunition so far. But the question is, are their inventories limited? Can Israel actually go to war with Iran if they did the unthinkable, which you suggested, and actually used a ballistic missile strike on an Israeli diplomatic office in Israel proper? Let's just, for the moment, say they did something that it was at least that striking. Is it a given that Israel can handle a war with Iran right now?
I think they can, assuming that the war objective is limited. If we're talking about a ground invasion of Iran, which is obviously a huge country with a very high population, no, they're not going to be able to do that, and I don't think they would be interested in pulling something like that off. By war, we're probably talking about air power and covert operations and cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure. That the Israelis can do. They've done it in the past. This would just be at a wider scale, right? And there are some the IDF is a very highly capable force, but they do have deficiencies. And by deficiencies, I mean their mid-air refueling capability is not really that great. So that's also something that they have to keep in mind. If they do long-range strikes inside Iran, can they keep that up? Can they sustain that over a period of weeks or months? That's something the Israelis really have not had to deal with or even think about. But if we're venturing towards a direct conflict, you bet that Israeli military planners are going to have to think about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you listen to somebody like Jack Keane, he's like, yeah, don't worry about that. They're not going to do anything anyway. Check this out.
A lot of talk and wringing of hands that this could escalate into World War III. That is not going to happen. Iran does not want a direct confrontation with the United States and go to war with the United States. All of their objectives in the Middle East that they're trying to achieve, domination and control, are gone because they lose their regime.
Now, I think it's a fair general truth that Iran doesn't want to go to war with the United States or to Israel. I think absolutely it is not in their interest to do so. They're having lots of difficulties economically right now. They also have their own domestic issues they have to keep worrying about, and fighting an external enemy is definitely not on the list of things that they would like to do. But the issue comes in if they get pushed too far. And in a related matter here, you also had Hezbollah actually also say they're interested in getting involved here.
The Lebanon-based Hezbollah group has also threatened Israel after the attack. They say that Israel will pay for killing officials from Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Hezbollah says that the enemy will face punishment and revenge for the crime.
Now, Jaquin says, yeah, don't worry, there's not going to be a wider war here. It's just not a concern. But if people start acting on some of their claims, whether it be Iran saying that they're going to strike something equivalent to an embassy, or Hezbollah saying that they're going to take some action here too, apparently beyond what they've been doing, since October, the opportunity and the possibility for this thing escalating and spinning out of anyone's control can't be taken off the table, I don't think.
No, and I wouldn't take it off the table. I mean, I think this is one of these things where it's kind of a low probability, but if it does occur, it would be a travesty and a high consequence to everybody in the region, including the United States. And let's remember, we have about 35 to 40,000 American troops throughout the region, and many of which are in countries that, like in Iraq and Syria, quite frankly, who are either in bed with the Iranians or have an incapacity to stop these militia groups that essentially in Iraq are running the government now de facto, if not de jure. So, it's a low probability, but it's one that U.S. policymakers have to pay attention to just by the sheer nature of our force presence in the region right now.
Yeah, and in fact, I want to talk about that force presence in the region and the potential vulnerability that places for the United States, because you've written on this before for defense priorities. I'm going to touch on that in just a second. But all of the concern for the United States isn't just on whether Iran or Hezbollah would make an attack, but if Netanyahu himself might think this could be a good time to act. Because note what he said almost exactly 1 year ago this month about what he thinks about it would take to get rid of Iran's nuclear program.
If you want to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power, the only way, a military nuclear power, the only way that you can stop them is with a credible military threat. This is what worked against Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapon program in Iraq. That was done by us. This is what worked against Bashar al-Assad's nuclear military plans in Syria. That was done by us. This is what worked against Gaddafi's Libya's military nuclear plan. It was stopped by a credible military threat on your part.
So you see, he keeps focusing on how nuclear programs have been eliminated by military means, twice of which were done by him. And so you can imagine at least the temptation for Israel to say, we're going to solve this problem now. And if Iran does anything big, that could prompt Israel to maybe try and make good on that threat from Netanyahu there. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting that he kind of brought up Iraq. I want to just say, it's true the Israelis did bomb Iraq's nuclear facility back in 1981. But, far from this it destroyed the facility, yes. And it destroyed Iraq's capability to build, hypothetically, to build a nuclear weapon. But Saddam didn't give up his ambitions. And if anything, the Israeli strike in 1981 against that facility kind of reinforced in Saddam's mind that a nuclear deterrent for Iraq was vital. Obviously, he didn't get that deterrent for a mix of different reasons, including UN inspections and IAEA inspections. But solving the Iranian nuclear program militarily, it's not a resolution. You're not solving anything. You're delaying the program. The Iranis always have an opportunity to rebuild what they lost, and I think we need to remember that. We also need to remember that we had a deal on the table that we signed with the Iranians that capped their nuclear enrichment capability by a decade, among other things. It capped the enrichment that they were allowed to store. It capped the enrichment they were allowed to produce, and it capped the amount of centrifuges that they were allowed to operate. And it worked pretty well.
Yeah, I wanted to go down that list. And Gary, if you could bring up that explainer that Dan wrote in 2022, we had that one up there. You had talked about and wrote about this earlier on in the Biden administration about what could happen if the Iran deal negotiations collapse. And I want to talk about the results in a second, but I want to zero in on that point you're bringing up there right now. Could you compare and contrast what the enrichment capacity and storage amounts that they had and any other key indicators on May 2018 when Trump first pulled out, and what they have today?
Yeah, it's like night and day. You know, the JCPOA capped the Iranian enrichment stockpile at 300 kilograms, and that was low enough where they could not use the fuel to assemble a nuclear bomb if they chose to do it. Today, I believe, I don't have the exact numbers, but I believe the stockpile is at least 20 times larger than what they
20
had back in
times.
2018, if not larger. And I'm working off of IEEA reports that were published last year. So, you know, pretty soon we'll get additional information about this. But yeah, I mean, we basically took the deal, threw it in the table, threw it out off the table into the trash can, and the Iranians, predictably, decided, well, we don't have any nuclear restrictions anymore.
And
We're free
what
to
was
pretty
the
much do whatever we
percentage
want.
they refined to what percent under the JCPO, and what are they doing right now?
Under the JCPOA, 3.67% enrichment was the cap. They couldn't go above that, or else the deal would be, you know, violated, and sanctions would be brought back onto the Iranian economy. Today, they are enriching to about 60%, which is one step short of the 90% that is, you know, commonly referred to as bomb fuel. So that's another instance where we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. When we left the JCPOA, we released all restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program. It was a, you know, I always describe it as one of the worst foreign policy decisions we've made this decade.
Which is really saying something.
Yeah.
Wow.
Quite a few on the list, right?
Yeah, there is. So you know, many. This is such a hot political item in the United States. You know, that if you were for the JCPOA, that almost meant you had to be a Democrat, and you're for Biden or Obama. And if you don't like the JCPOA, that's because you have to be a Trump or a Republican. You have to be against it. But taking the politics out of it, just looking at the practical end results, it doesn't seem like it's better for America than it was before. A bad, flawed JCPOA or none, and where they're at today seems pretty starkly clear.
100%. And I think it's sort of an indictment on how we view diplomacy in general. You know, we have this assumption that we can attain the ideal diplomatic agreement without many concessions on our side. And you know, back in the real world, that's just not how diplomacy works. You have to give something to get something. And I think a lot of the resistance to the Iran nuclear deal was the fact that we gave the Iranians concessions that a lot of people were not comfortable with. You have to weigh these things on a simple, neutral cost benefit analysis and leave the emotion aside. And when you do that, I think the record is pretty clear that we were better off in the deal than we are now outside of it.
So what do you make of that question we had on screen there just a second ago? Was the JCPOA a legitimate agreement, or did the West make it for a tripwire to try and catch up Iran in some way?
Well, I think it was a legitimate agreement. I mean, we came into this thing basically. We concluded that this was the best way and the most peaceful way of managing this very long-lasting problem that we've had with the Iranians since the early 2000s. And that's, you know, making sure that they did not assemble a nuclear device. We chose to do that through diplomacy instead of military force or sanctions. And part of that is because military force would only delay the program, maybe by a year or two, and sanctions did not work. You know, they didn't work to compel the Iranians to change their strategic calculus in the decision making.
So according to your explainer there in 2022, if the negotiations fail, you were discussing the options. So they apparently did, because nothing has happened since that time either. What do you suggest are our options today? What can the administration do? What is it doing?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think the administration is necessarily interested in getting back into the agreement, and part of that is because the Iranians, you know, don't trust our word anymore, because we kind of, you know, backtracked on what we agreed to. So the administration thus far has been trying to strike informal agreements with the Iranians, basically saying, look, cap what you're doing now, don't go above 60% enrichment, dilute some of your stockpile to a more manageable level, and in turn will possibly loosen some of the sanctions enforcement So it's been an ad hoc agreement. I think that's probably the best that we're going to get, certainly in an election year.
And it's just unfortunate that if you ever talk about removing one sanction from anything, there's just all these howls from Washington, because we only believe in putting sanctions on. We never believe in putting them off, which is supposed to be the utility so that you adjust behavior, and then they get the sanctions resolved when they do what we want. But unfortunately, that just isn't how it works right now in Washington, D.C. The diplomatic issue is broken. In the last few minutes we have here, I want to turn to the other explainer you wrote last year on withdrawing U.S. troops from Iraq and from Syria. Now, a lot of people want to say, and I've certainly been accused of this many times because I've written similar kinds of things, that we should withdraw our troops there because they prove nothing more, in my view, than a strategic vulnerability, but provide no utility for our country. How do you argue here that we can, especially in light of all that's going on now, withdraw those troops? How would it be done? And then I got a follow-up question on that. First of all, how would we actually do that?
Well, I think it could probably be done relatively quickly. I mean, we have 2,500 troops in Iraq right now, spread over, I believe, 2 or 3 pretty significant bases, large bases. And in Syria, we have about 900 troops stationed in a constellation of very small bases that are very hard to defend. And one of the reasons I argued in that explainer, in that paper, to get out of Syria was because our troops were exposed to a litany of Shia rocket and missile attacks that were going on a pretty regular basis. And thankfully, we only had minor injuries to those attacks. But speaking personally, I don't want to wait until an American troop dies before we have to make a decision to leave. I'd rather leave before casualties.
Well, I looked on that part of paper before we came on the air here, and I was reminded that you actually wrote, as of this writing, no Americans had been killed in this. And now then that's no longer the case because of those 3 troops that were killed earlier this year in Jordan in this mission, which, as a vet, was driving me crazy that thing finally happened that you had been warning about. But here's the big question that we have. How do you answer the argument that, oh my gosh, you can't leave Iraq and Syria? That's exactly what Iran wants. If you do that, you're playing right into the hands of Tehran, because that's part of their objective. What do you say to that argument?
Well, my response would be, I don't care what the Iranians say, and I don't care what the Iranians think. We should do what's in our interest. And, essentially what these people are saying is, let's give Iran a veto over U.S. foreign policy. That's basically what they're arguing for. And my point is, just because the Iranians agree about something doesn't necessarily mean we have to do the exact opposite just to frustrate their ambitions. Some people look at the Middle East exclusively through the containment of Iran. And I look at personally, and I know you do too, Danny, we look at the Middle East through how do you accomplish core American security interests,
Yes.
which we've accomplished over the last 2 decades with a pretty minimal force presence until we sort of, during the Obama and Trump administrations, poured more resources into the region. So, my argument would be, don't give the Iranians a veto over foreign policy, and the Americans, the United States government should be doing, should be making decisions based on what our interests are in the region, not on what the Iranians say, every other day. That's what I would respond to.
Yeah. And then last question, what do you say to those people who argue, and I hear this a lot too, no, we have to keep those troops there. Forget about Iran. We have to keep them there because they're doing a valid counter ISIS mission. We had Kirby, we've shown him on here saying this a lot, that it's really important and we can't let them go because, oh my gosh, ISIS is going to come get us if we don't. What do you say to that argument?
Well, the United States is not the only entity on the ground in Iraq and Syria fighting ISIS. Nobody in the region, nobody in Syria or Iraq has an interest in letting ISIS regenerate to the point that they reestablish a territorial caliphate. Bashar al-Assad, the Iraqi government, the Iranians, the Russians, the Turks, the Kurds, they disagree on a lot. They do not disagree on keeping ISIS under control or at a manageable level. So, we sort of discount the agency of the local stakeholders in the region. You know, this notion that everything would fall apart if 900 troops left Syria just strikes me as fanciful and sort of kind of comical if it wasn't so sad.
Right.
You know?
Right. That's exactly right. And I can assure you, because I was once stationed in an isolated location in Iraq, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't have quite that many, but we spent most of our time providing self-defense and perimeter security, and very little actually going and doing operations out there. And so I can assure you that little dot in the Syrian map is not preventing ISIS from doing anything in that country. Dan, these are some great views and some great information. So grateful for you to come on today. And we're going to keep watching this issue here with especially with Tehran and what they may do in response to this their embassy bombing. And we'll probably be reaching back out to you again for more expert commentary.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks for having me.
And we thank you guys for joining us too. That wraps up our deep dive for today. Please be sure and like and subscribe to this if you haven't already, because we want to make sure you keep getting all these updates that we give in, because we're going to hold our country's feet to the fire. Our leaders, I don't care whether it's Republican, Democrat, if they're doing something that's not in your interest, we're going to be calling it out. And you can count on us to keep doing that. Thanks ever so much. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.